And then the angel I had seen standing on the sea and the land raised his right hand to heaven, and he swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created the heavens and all that is in them, the earth and all that is in it, the sea and all that is in it, and said, there will be no more delay. The days when the seventh angel is about to sound his trumpet, the mystery of God will be accomplished, just as he announced to his servants, the prophets. We have the two witnesses in Revelation 11. And after the two witnesses, at the very hour, there was a severe earthquake. So at the beginning, at the end of the seals, there's an earthquake. At the end of the trumpets, there's an earthquake. And a tenth of the city collapsed. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake. And the survivors were terrified and gave glory to God of heaven. The second war has passed, the third war is coming soon. So the seventh trumpet, angel sounded his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven which said, the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever. So then God's temple in heaven was opened, and within his temple was seen the Ark of the Covenant, and there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, pearls of thunder, and earthquake, and severe hailstorms. So is this a time of the reset? Was this one of the resets at the end of Rome? Because come Revelation 12, we now see the woman and the dragon. This is the story of the woman, the church, and the dragon. Revelation 13, we have a change of scene. The dragon stood on the shore. I think in the NIV it says the dragon. In the King James Bible it implies that it is John who's standing on the shore of the sea. It's hard to tell, but either way, it's a scene that's being described, and the beasts are coming out of the sea, one out of the earth. So this is a new feast, I believe, which is the feast of Yom Kippur, or atonement. And they are atoned at the end. It's the judgment of God's wrath by the great winepress, trodden out by God's wrath. Now remember in Matthew 27, verse 51, when Jesus died, and behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from top to the bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent, and the graves were open, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose. So we've got the first resurrection here. Nobody wants to recognize this scripture, but it's telling us that it wasn't only Jesus who was resurrected at this time. There were the first fruits resurrection, and came out of the graves after his resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared unto many. I mean, why doesn't any of the church recognize this scripture? Because they don't understand it. The first fruit. So is it so hard to believe that the saints were seen in the clouds of heaven, that these resurrected people came back for the 144,000 around the time of the fall of Jerusalem in 66 to 70 AD? So getting back to Revelation 13, it said, I saw one of the heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. Now, I've heard many Christian preachers say that this head that's wounded was Rome, and it very well may be. It's either the fall of Rome, and we have the Roman Empire resurrected under the religious Roman Empire is then reborn with the eastern and western districts. The rise of Constantine, AD 306 to 24. So Constantine rules the western province of Rome and the eastern province in Anatolia from Constantinople. And then once the western side of Rome falls, it's resurrected under the Holy Roman Empire of Charlemagne. Or one of the heads, I had a thought, and I'm not saying this is it, but I'm wondering whether the head may actually be the kingdom of Israel or the kingdom of Jerusalem, which was part of the Roman Empire anyway. It was one of the provinces in the Roman Empire, because in 70 AD, Jerusalem was given a blow and a wound and one might think that it was completely destroyed. However, in the First Crusade, we have the resurrected Kingdom of Jerusalem. And the Kingdom of Jerusalem, officially known as the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem or the Frankish Kingdom of Palestine, was a Crusader state established in the southern Levant by Godfrey of Bouillon in 1099 after the First Crusade. The kingdom lasted nearly 200 years from 1099 until 1291, when its last remaining possession, Acre, was destroyed by the Mamluks. Its history is divided into two distinct periods. The First Kingdom of Jerusalem lasted from 1099 to 1187 before being almost entirely overrun by Saladin. So this is where we start seeing the beasts of the earth. Following the Third Crusade, the kingdom was re-established in Acre in 1192 and lasted until the city's destruction in 1291. The Second Kingdom is sometimes called the Second Kingdom of Jerusalem or the Second Kingdom of Acre. After its new capital, Acre remained the capital, except for the 2 decades which followed Frederick II of Hohenstaufen regaining the city of Jerusalem from the Ayyubites during the Sixth Crusade through diplomacy. The vast majority of the Crusaders who established and settled the Kingdom of Jerusalem were from the Kingdom of France, as were the knights and soldiers who made up the bulk of the steady flow of reinforcements throughout the 200-year span of its existence. Its rulers and elite were therefore of French origin. The French Crusaders who brought the French language to the Levant, thus making Old French the lingua franca of the Crusader states. Local Muslims and Christians made up the majority of the population on the countryside, but European, mainly French and Italian colonists also settled in the villages. Sugar refining based on local sugarcane plantations developed into an important industry. That's interesting, sugarcane in a desert region. You know, we have the city of Jerusalem mainly being a wasteland right up until the First World War, a desert wasteland, and yet they're growing sugarcane, which is usually a plant that is planted in tropical regions or regions that have high humidity. So it says geographic boundaries. At first, the kingdom was little more than a loose collection of towns and cities captured during the First Crusade. But at its height in the mid-12th century, the kingdom encompassed roughly the territory of modern-day Israel, Palestine, and southern parts of Lebanon. From the Mediterranean Sea, the kingdom extended in a thin strip of land from Beirut in the north to the Sinai Desert in the south, into modern Jordan and Syria in the east, and towards Fatimid Egypt in the west. 3 other Crusader states founded during and after the First Crusade were located further north. The country of Edessa in 1097 and 1144, the Principality of Antioch 1098 to 1268, and the country of Tripoli in 1109 to 1289. While all 3 were independent, they were closely tied to Jerusalem. Beyond these, to the north and west, lay the states of Armenian Cilicia and the Byzantine Empire, which Jerusalem had a close relationship in the 12th century. Further east, various Muslim emirates were located, which were ultimately allied with the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. The kingdom was ruled by King Amory of Lusignan in 1197 to 1205, the King of Cyprus, another Crusader state found during the Third Crusade. Dynastic ties also strengthened with Tripoli, Antioch, and Armenia. The kingdom was soon increasingly dominated by the Italian city-states of Venice and Genoa. There we go. That's very interesting too, because I know that Venice went to the kings of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and they were given a quarter in the city to run their business from. Jerusalem was really important to the Silk Road and to trading. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II reigned from 1220 to 1250, had ambitions in the Crusader state, claiming the kingdom by marriage, but his presence sparked a civil war in 1228 to 1243. Now, when I'm reading this, I'm reading dates. I don't know if these dates are accurate. I'm just going on the general consensus view of what happened at this time. So we have this re-established Jerusalem, this new kingdom of Jerusalem, and we have these Crusaders who are given a decree by the Pope Urban II, Champagne in France. Now remember, we had these Herod lines in France, specifically Lyon, but they were in the high ranks of the church, the bishops. It says here, the Turks and Arabs have attacked. They have killed and captured many and have destroyed the churches and devastated the empire. On this account, I, or rather the Lord, beseech you to destroy the vile race from the lands of our friends. Urban II's speech at Council of Clermont in 1095, according to Fulcher of Chartres, quoted in the Internet Medieval Sourcebook. Urban II, a French pope, head of the Catholic Church, ruled at the end of the 11th century. He was known as an excellent organizer and tireless worker for renowned political power of the Church. Following the rule of Gregory the Seventh, who was Pope from 1075 to 1085, Urban II helped solidify gains made for the papacy, or the office of the Pope, against the political power of the kings of Europe. He developed a central governing structure for the Church and ultimately made the papacy a powerful player in Europe, equal to early monarchs or kingdoms of the continent. Clever in the use of the spoken word, Urban's most lasting achievement was his connection with the Crusades. Speaking at a meeting of church leaders held in 1095 in the southern French town of Clermont, he urged the crowd to spread the concept of a crusade against Arab and Turkish Muslims. Now, he was born into French nobility. I've heard he's a crypto. I believe he may have been related to these Radahite people. And I also want to go into the idea of Simon Magus as being the Peter, or Simon Peter, who actually started the Roman Catholic Church. But for now, I just want to talk about the Crusades and the rise of the Beast of the Earth. So I'm just going to play a short video from Activist News on BitChute. He has a video on Anacletus II, the Jewish AntiPope. And the reason I'm playing this is because he was several popes after Pope Urban. He was anti-pope to Pope Innocent II, and he was pope during the time of this Kingdom of Jerusalem. And it shows links to why I believe the Crusades were launched and who was behind the launch of the Crusades. So I'll play that now. I'll leave a link in the descriptions.
In 12th century Europe. With that being said, let's begin in page 319. Chapter 25. A Jewish cardinal becomes pope. The highest aim of the Jewish fifth column in the clergy has always been to gain control of the papacy and to place a secret Jew on the chair of St. Peter. For this would make it possible for it to use the church for the revolutionary imperialist plans of the synagogue and to cause harm to our religion. In the year 1130, 832 years ago, Jewry nearly attained this goal. For the investigation of this horrifying chapter in history, we have also made use of recognized Jewish and other sources which are free of anti-Semitism. The world-renowned historian Fernando Gregorius, as is known in scholarly circles, and who was in addition extremely favourably disposed towards the Jews, reported about these historical events in his work History of the City of Rome in the Middle Ages. The first translation into Italian was financed by the city government of Rome, which in addition provided the author with the title of Honorary Citizen of the City of Rome. The following quotations are taken from his work. Book 2, Volume 2, Chapter 3, The Perleoni, Their Jewish Origin. the synagogue. Peter Leo and his son Peter, the cardinal, schism between Innocent II and Anacletus II, Roger I, King of Sicily. A purely civic schism would necessarily have proved to the world that the German kings were not always responsible for the division in the church. The wealth and the power of the Perleoni, and still more their great services in relation to the church, awoke in them the hope of making a member of their family into pope. The astonishing fact that they were descended from Jews and had reached such high regards gives us the opportunity to cast a glance at the synagogue in Rome. Gregorius describes the development of Jewish community in Rome, and then mentions that Benjamin der Tudela, the famous Jew, travelled over half the world to visit all Jewish organisations of his time. Of the Jews in Rome, he says that, at the time of Pope Alexander III, they had rabbis such as Daniel, Gieli, Joab, Nathan, Menachem, and others of the Trastevere. According to Gregorius, the Jews have only been persecuted and enslaved in the Eternal City. Their race understood how, on the basis of their slyness, their inventive talent, and the power of gold accumulated in secret, to assert themselves against their oppressors. The first physicians and richest bankers were Jews. In their wretched houses they loaned money at usurious interest, and in their book of debts stood the names of those most respected councils of Rome, and even the popes, who were short of money. And from this despised Jewish synagogue emanated a family of senators who had to thank the usurer for their wealth and power. The grandfather of mentioned Peter Leo, who played a very important role in the Investiture dispute, also had relations in his capacity as a banker with the papal residents, and often helped out with the money. He finally allowed himself to be baptized and received the name Benedictus Christianus. Very soon his son Leo, who with baptism had received the name of Pope Leo V, could ensure himself an important future, as was fitting for a rich, sharp-minded, bold, and an ambitious young man. He intermarried with Roman magnates who wished to marry their sons to rich Jewesses, or their daughters to the sons of baptized Jews. Gregorius assures us that one of his sons, by the name of Peter Leo, who was the first to bear the surname Pierre Leoni, had much influence in Rome and was always asked for advice." Unquote. Besides his fortress alongside the Marcellus Theatre, which in no doubt his father had built, he also controlled the Tiber Islands situated nearby. Urban II also made him into the protector of Castel St. Angelo, and died, to use the words of Gregorius, in the house of his creditor and protector. His successor, so it continues, therefore made efforts to obtain the favour of powerful Pierleoni. However, the people detested him because he was a usurer. The nobility hated him, and we can observe that he, in spite of his friendship with Pope Paschalis, did not ask for the perfecture of his son because he was of the new nobility. The friendship of the popes, the glitter of kinship, wealth and power, very soon wiped out the stain of his Jewish origin, and a short time later the Pierleoni became the most respected princely family in Rome. Leo and his successor bore the tide Consul of Rome, according to the Gregorius, proudly and with masterly dignity, as if they were very ancient partisans. The famous historian adds further that the Pierleoni were Welfs, i.e. were of the papal party against the German emperors. For we must not forget that at a time, at least in appearance, they were devout Christians.
So I just want to cut in here for a second, and we can see that Pope Urban II had a obviously good relationship with the Pierleoni family, and Pope Urban gave the decree for the Crusades to go ahead in 1095. And one can only wonder the other cardinals who later became popes' relationship with this banking family and their possible debt connections and designs for gaining back Jerusalem.
The following reports of Gregorius is also very revealing. From this we learn that Pierleoni was buried on the 2nd of June of the year 1128, with so many marks of honours as never before for a consul in ancient Rome. Even the tombs of the popes of that time were destroyed. Then the mausoleum of this fat Jew, as Gregorius calls him in this connection, although he was officially very Catholic, continues to stand. He reports that he left behind many descendants. These sons of the ghetto were so unbelievably rich that one of his sons became Pope and another partisan of Rome. One of his daughters married Roger of Sicily. This powerful lord had selected a church post for his son Peter. Would one even be able to refuse him the violet cloak of a cardinal? Was even the striving of the robes of the Pope to be dared for a son of the Père Leone? Young Peter was sent to Paris in order to complete his education. There he belonged without doubt to the students of Abelard. After ending of his study, he became a monk of the Cluny. This was doubtless the best recommendation for a candidate of the papal dignity, upon the wishes of his father. Paschalis summoned him back to Rome and named him Cardinal of San Cosmo and San Damian. Together with his brother, he then accompanied Galatio to France, returned with Calixtus, and became Cardinal of Santa Maria in Trastevere, whence his family originated. Later, he became papal ambassador in France, where he convened councils, and in England, where he was received by King Henry like a prince. Holy Church had accumulated experience in the centuries-long struggle against the synagogue of Satan, and now correspondingly built up its defense. It passed anti-Jewish church laws which, if followed, would have provided a defense. Unfortunately, there were, as we have already seen, monarchs like Witzer, Ludwig the Pious, and Peter the Cruel, who submitted to the influence of the Jews and caused the anti-Jewish church laws to become ineffective. Thus, they protected the principal enemy of Christendom and allowed him to become deeply rooted in the government of the state, which had tragic consequences for the church, as also for the peoples who fell into the hands of the Jews. These tragedies were, however, locally restricted, for while Witticer or Ludwig of Pius delivered their people to the enemy, the papacy and other Christian states conducted further the struggle for defences of the Church and Catholicism in a zealous manner. The new situation in the 11th century, for the Holy See itself, was doubtless the prelude for a universal tragedy, not locally restricted, which was to extend the whole of Christianity, for the enemy was on the point of conquering the chair of the Church, and this crisis had necessarily to draw the entire Christian world into its effect. The bitter investiture dispute between Pope and Emperor and the problem of predominance were to offer Jewry the favourable opportunity to advancing to the Holy See, by offering their very valuable services and doubtless revealing themselves as pleasing. In this struggle between popes and emperors, the Jews began to take decisive side with the party of the Welfs, i.e. for the Pope, who under the existing conditions could not reject this unexpected, seemingly valuable support, also in the economic respect, which was then urgently necessary for the Holy See. In this trouble, the church laws, the results of the centuries of experience, were at first forgotten. Through their gainful seeking adherence to the Pope, the Jews had penetrated into a domain which had hitherto been refused to them. The fratricidal struggles among the Christians themselves helped the synagogue of Satan, best of all, to further their imperialist plans. This they now attained by supporting the church power against the civic. In the 16th century, thus 450 years later, they wished to finally destroy Christianity by defending the knights against the papacy. In this case, they had made themselves indispensable as bankers, and the Pope had to hold them in order to solve his economic problems. The famous rabbi, poet and historian, Louis Israel Newman, writes in his extremely interesting work, Jewish Influence on the Reform Movements of Christianity, concerning the schism called forth by Cardinal Peter Père Leone in Holy Church. He attributes to the latter a decisive importance for the development of so-called Jewish heresy in the Middle Ages, in which popes, councils and Inquisition with justice see the origin of all heresies. For the Inquisition proved that the secret Jews, i.e. the Jewish heretics, were the organisers and spreaders of the remaining heretical movements.
So in this book by Dana C. Munro, The Popes and the Crusades, it states on page 353, the leaders of various crusades to the Orient were not designated by the popes, with the exception of Urban II and Innocent III. The popes did not take an active part in laying the plans for the crusades against the Muslims. The expedition for the for which Urban made the plans was successful. In a sense, orders were not obeyed. The leaders in the church, like St. Bernard, were able to throw the blame for failure upon the ignorance and sins of the Crusaders. I think it probably had more to do with it than that. This is my opinion, that there was a driving force behind these Crusaders to go into the Holy Land. And we have this connection with the Pierre Leone family, with Pope Urban, who got this crusade underway to take back the Holy Land, or to take back Jerusalem. And we know that the Knights Templar were the first bankers and were in with the banking families, or the early initiation of banking and usury on Europe. And this was a really big problem for some of the aristocracy of Italy, were against the rich Jewish families and the usury. Now, we have the city of Venice and Genoa pushing for a quarter in the city of Jerusalem when the kingdom of Jerusalem was established. So I think this is probably an indication to who was one of the major forces pushing for this crusade. So it goes on to say, Jerusalem was conquered and held for some scores of years, but the holy city did not become the head of the church state as the Pope probably hoped that it would. When before its capture in 1099, the leaders gathered to discuss the election of the ruler, the church party in the army protested, saying that no earthly monarch ought to wear a crown of gold where our Saviour had worn a crown of thorns. For the moment the nobles yielded after the capture of the city, they elected Godfrey, defender of the Holy Sepulchre. This title probably marked a concession to the point of view held by the clerical party when Dagobert was elected Patriarch of Jerusalem and demanded that Godfrey should give up the holy city. The latter temporized, promising that he would hand over Jerusalem to the Patriarch when he had secured other conquests. But after his death, his brother Baldwin was crowned king, and Jerusalem gradually became a hereditary monarchy in which the Patriarch was clearly subordinate to the king, and the latter was wholly independent of the Pope. The Christian conquests in Syria, instead of being the home of garrisons ever ready to propagate the faith by the sword, soon became commercial centers whose inhabitants were intent mainly on living in peace and carrying on trade with infidels. So here we have it again. It's showing that the main purpose of this city of Jerusalem was trade and the Silk Road. They viewed askance the bands of crusaders from the west who might interfere with their commerce by provoking hostilities. Even members of the military order, whose main purpose was supposed to be the defense of the Holy Land, formed friendships with Muslims who they entertained in their castles and allowed to pray to Allah in their chapels. The direction of the Great Crusades escaped from the popes, and in spite of Innocent's commands and repeated excommunications, the French and the Venetians persisted in going to Zara and Constantinople and in sacking those Christian cities. So here we go, there's a big player here with the French and the Venetians. Now, what do the French and the Venetians have in common? Radahites. Frederick II, excommunicated for not going on a crusade, went and was excommunicated again for going while excommunicated. Despite the efforts of the Pope and of the leading churchmen in the Holy Land, he made peace with the Mohammedans and secured Jerusalem by diplomacy. The Crusaders who settled in the Holy Land soon ceased to be as devout and narrow as their brethren in the West. They intermarried with the natives, both heretics and Muslims, adopted the customs of their wives and some of their superstitions. Even the Templars were generally believed to be contaminated by the Mohammedan beliefs. So we can see anyone who's informed about the Knights Templars and Freemasonry, we know that high up in Freemasonry, that Allah, or the worship of Allah, is a prominent religious belief, as well with the Kabbalah. And we know that they worship Baphomet. So, this is where they're getting all this Eastern doctrine from. The monastic chroniclers, especially those from the West, are very outspoken about the evil lives led by the Christians of the ranks, even the patriarchs in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. From the East, these conditions spread to the West. To the great detriment of the church, the merchants carried back not merely Oriental wares, but also Oriental heresies, which spread rapidly in the West along the commercial highways. Soon, crusades had to be preached against the heresies, which were mainly due to the Crusades. All of these factors detracted from the power of the popes. It was easier for heresies to spread because of the growing distrust of the church due to many causes, e.g., all teaching in France, Germany, and England had been done by the clerics, and the Crusaders found that many things which they had been taught were untrue. One chronicler of the First Crusade naively expressed his surprise at the bravery of the Turks, who had been taught to believe were cowards. Possibly this idea was due to urban speech at Clermont, for William of Malmesbury reports that the Pope said the Turks are feeble men who, not having courage to engage in close encounter, love a flying mode of warfare. For the Turks never ventures upon a close fight, but when driven from his station, bends his bow at a distance and trusts the wind with his mediated wound, as he has poisoned arrows, venom, and not valor, inflicts death on the man he strikes. Whatever the effects, when I attribute to fortune, not to courage, because he wars by fighting and by poison. It is apparent too that every race born in this region, being scorched with the intense heat of the sun, abounds more in reflection than in blood, and therefore they avoid coming to close quarters because they are aware how little blood they possess. Now, why would a pope say this stuff, Pope Urban? Without an intention to cause anger in these knights who were only looking to war at any time for any reason. And he obviously had a political and financial agenda to get the Crusades happening. It goes on to say, many other Crusader learned that the information which he had received had been misinformation and began to doubt. The political crusades brought discredit upon the church and the popes who ordered them. Many men realized that the popes were using their power for worldly ends. In the 13th century, it was ever more difficult to induce men to take the cross. In 1233, the Pope offered an indulgence for 20 days to all who would listen to a sermon on the Crusades. In 1249, the indulgence was increased to 40 days, and in 1265 to 100 days, and in the hope that some might be led to take the cross. Many of the preachers were charged with misappropriation of the funds which they raised for the Crusades. Walter von der Vogelweide voices his feeling in his verse. Little methinks of all this silver in God's cause is spent, to part with a great treasure priests are ill content. As Walter was a partisan of the Hohenstaufens and opposed to the papacy, he might be considered prejudiced. But the same idea was common, e.g. Matthew Paris, the historiographer of the monastery of St. Albans, writes, by divers wiles the Roman curia strove to take their property from the simple people of God, seeking nothing but their gold and silver. Thomas Fuller later put in bluntly, the Pope got a bag of money by it. All reformers in the church felt that this wealth had brought corruption in its train, and while few realized the part that the Crusaders had played in bringing in this wealth, many denounced the corruption of the papal curia and its greed for gold. Church unity was attained for only a short time. The Greek Empire, for whose aid the first Crusaders had been preached, had been brought under the Latin Church, but had been so weakened by the attacks of the Crusaders that it could not much longer be the bulwark of Europe against Islam. The fall of the Latin Empire of Constantinople led to the return of the Greek Patriarch. Heresy and opposition to the church spread in the West. There was a marked decline in religious fervor. Interest in the next world dwindled as the zest in living the present life increased because it seemed better, worth living. There was a great growth in the use of indulgences, and it would be especially interesting to trace out their connection with the privileges of the Crusaders. It is not feasible here, however, to follow the whole course of events. The facts which have been given are sufficient to show how completely the hopes of the popes had been frustrated. If we weigh all the evidence, we see the manifold ways in which the Crusaders affected the power of the popes, and we may well conclude that some roots of the Reformation are to be found in them and the Pope's connection with them. So this is Princeton University, April 1916. So what's really interesting here is we see that the church was corrupt. So we have this whore riding this beast that has been corrupted by Babylonian mystery religions. We have a crusade to take back Jerusalem for monetary purposes, for gold and silver. We have a banking Jewish elite connected to the decree to go on crusade. We have a Venetian and French, and let's include Genoan interest that seems to be pushing other political agendas other than the Pope's. And I think that agenda probably came from this Pierre Leone side of politics, as not all popes or cardinals were on side with them, all had dabbled in their use of usury. So in this journal article from Cambridge University Press, written by Herbert Bloch, the Schism of Anacletus II and the Glanfield forgeries of Peter the Deacon of Monte Cassino. So it says, number 1, the Schism, its origin and its spread over Europe. When in the early morning hours of February 14, 1130, Pope Honorius II closed his eyes forever, a crisis within the Church of Rome broke into the open, which long had been in the making. The forces which had dominated the Curia for 80 years, which had given to the world the great popes of the Reform, were challenged and swept aside by the revolution of an energetic minority which during less than a decade had steadily increased its influence. In the Sacred College, its undisputed leader was the Chancellor Heinrich, a Frenchman who had been appointed to his high office in 1123 by French Pope Calixtus II, or Callistus II. It was he who devised the measures which were to ensure the succession to his party, measures which under the circumstances were bound to result in an uncanonical election, and as a natural consequence in the second election by the outraged majority. The passion which the double election of the day aroused were for many years to carry discord to every court, every bishop's palace, and every monastery in Europe. And though they have subsided since, they still smoulder in many a learned book or paper of our own day. So however the dramatic events which preceded and accompanied the double election of February 14, 1130 have been told, they cannot be disregarded here altogether. For the schism which sprang from these events cast its shadow also over the Abbey of Monte Cassino. It forms the background of the Glanfield forgeries which are dealt with in these pages, and so calls for a brief account of its most important aspect. After Honorius II had died in the monastery of St. Andrew on the Calais, whether he had been brought by Heinrich to make certain the armed successor from the neighbouring fortifications of the Frangipani, his mortal remains were hurriedly and unceremoniously interred in the courtyard of the monastery, and Heinrich proceeded to the election of the new pope. A committee of 8 electors, consisting of 5 adherents and 3 opponents of the Chancellor, had been reduced to a rump committee by the withdrawal of 2 of its members in protest against a breach of agreement on the part of Heimrich. One of the 2 was the man who turned out to be the candidate of the majority for the pontificate. Among the 6 remaining members, the Cardinal Deacon Gregory of St. Anglius was elected, while the Cardinal Priest Petrus Piscianus of St. Susanna, significantly the most distinguished canonist in the Sacred College, remonstrated in vain against the uncanonical character of the whole procedure. Escorted by the arms of the Frangipani, the new Pope was invested with the purple, in the Latin as Innocent II. In the meantime, the majority of the cardinals assembled in St. Mark informed the election of Cardinal Gregory by Petrus Piscianus. They eschewed all further canonical formalities and unanimously elected the cardinal priest Petrus Leonis Pierre Leoni. Now this is really interesting because it's the majority of cardinals that want Pierre Leoni, who became the anti-pope, to Innocent II, and a minority wanted Innocent. So we know that Pierre Leoni is the Jewish banking family of Rome, and the majority cardinals wanted him as pope. So we can see that this banking and usury has infiltrated the hierarchy of the church all around. Petrus Leonis Pierre Leoni, son of Petrus Leonis of St. Mary in Trastevere or St. Calixtus, who assumed the name Anacletus II. The validity of this procedure was certainly questionable, but even 30 years later it could be said that Anacletus had been elected by the majority and by men of greater learning and authority. The ensuing conflict has often been described as a struggle between Frangipani and Pierre Leoni, a curious misconception of the plane on which this controversy took place and of the role which the Frangipani then played in Roman politics. Much larger issues were at stake then than the rivalries of the 2 Roman families. As for the Frangipani, they did not have any consistent policy at all, except that the following what they regarded from one moment to the other as their personal advantage. The record of the house of Pierre Leoni is of a different nature. Ever since the great-grandfather of the Cardinal Pierre Leoni, Bruges, had been converted to Christianity, adopting the name Benedict, his family, which later led by his son Leo about 1063, and then by his grandson Petrus Leonis between 1124 and 1130, wielded considerable influence through wealth and connections, stood faithfully by the popes of the Reform. Indeed, by assisting them effectively also in times of great danger, they contributed to saving the Reform in a decisive degree. Peter Pierre Leon, the son of Petrus Leonis, who had been a student in Paris and a monk in Cluny, was raised to cardinal's rank by Papal II in various capacities, especially as legate to England and France. He served the church and served it well. His abilities were recognized by his enemies, and there can be no doubt that he was regarded by the other cardinals as the leader of the majority of the Sacred College. It is the composition of this majority which yields the key to the understanding of the schism. Of the 21 cardinals who elected Anacletus, not less than 13 belonged to the Sacred College since the date of Papal II, like the Pope of their choice. Most of them had grown grey in the service of the Curia. They represented the legacy of the Reform. To believe that they were ready tools in the hands of the Cardinal Pierre Leon is preposterous. Their decision was not only an answer to the election of St. Andrew, but a protest against the pontificate of Honorius II, who himself had been elected under controversial circumstances. The oldest member of the Sacred College, Petrus, Senex, Bishop of Portus since 1102, perhaps represents best the older generation. A letter preserved by William of Malmesbury, he urged his fellow Bishop of Ostia, Praeneste Albanium, and Sabina to stop abusing their opponents, and while abstaining from any harsh words against innocent, he severely rebuked them for their procedure, voicing the hope that they still would declare themselves for Anacletus. He says, "I saw that the election of Anacletus was held according to canon law, and I confirmed it with the sanction of God." And he concludes with solemnly declaring his adherence to the unity of the Church and of the truth and justice. At first it seems as if Anacletus' cause would prevail. The clergy of Rome, the aristocracy, and the people, after a few weeks, even the hostile Frangipani recognized Anacletus as the legitimate pope. After the Concordant of Worms of September 23, 1122 had ostensibly brought the controversy of investiture to the peaceful conclusion, Calixtus II decided to commemorate by a monument the event which he regarded as a victory of the papacy. He built the pontifical oratory in the Lateran Palace, dedicating it to St. Nicholas of Bari, and decorated the adjoining Camera Pro Secretis Concilius with 4 frescoes representing the triumph of the popes of the Reform over their anti-popes. An even more meaningful painting was reserved for the apse of St. Nicholas. It was divided into 2 zones. In the upper zone, the Virgin is being crowned between the kneeling founders. At her right, Calixtus II. At her left, Anacletus II. The 2 popes are flanked by Sylvester I and Anacletus I, Anacletus II's patron, respectively. In the center of the lower zone stands St. Nicholas, surrounded by the popes of the Reform, to whom are added Leo the Great and Gregory the Great. They all are distinguished by the halo, and the attribute Sanctus exalts them into sainthood. The scheme below will make the arrangement clear. So between the 2 zones runs the dedicatory inscription as follows. It's in Latin, so I'll read it. The inscription clearly indicates 2 phases in the building of the chapel, separated from each other by at least 6 years, the duration of Honorius II's pontificate. The actual construction is ascribed to Calixtus II, the pictorial decoration to Anacletus II. The conception of the upper zone and of the verses evidently belong to Anacletus, and both zones are linked together through the appearance of great popes of the distant past, Sylvester I, Leo I, Gregory I, not to speak of Anacletus I. There is not the slightest reason to doubt the truthfulness of Anacletus' claim in the dedicatory verses. The composition of the apse as a whole has been felicitously called the apotheosis of the victorious papacy. One might perhaps add to papacy the words of the Reform, for the series of popes is complete, from 1061 to 1124. That includes the 2 popes from Monte Cassino, Victor III and Gelasius II. The great popes of antiquity fulfill a double purpose. They are the well-known outstanding models for the popes of the Reform. At the same time, they raise the later popes with whom they are represented to their own level of generally recognized sainthood. The schism of Anacletus has been recently termed the end of the papacy of the Reform. More correctly, one might say of the Gregorian Reform, in contrast to the new Reform of St. Bernard. Then the apse of St. Nicholas in the Lateran is indeed the most impressive document of this end. With the rare forcefulness, Anacletus has here set a monument to the past to which he himself belonged as its last representative, figure 1. Already in 1130, Anacletus decided to reserve the anti-Norman policy of Honorius II, in September of that year, the negotiations had reached the desired result. At a meeting in Avellino, he agreed to have Roger crowned King of Sicily in return for the promise of homage to the Holy See. Coronation took place in Palmero on December 27, 1130. So if we have a look at this picture, which is what the fresco was, and if we keep in mind who Anacletus was and his background, we can see that this is a very Mystery Babylon painting. We have Jesus up here, and he's made all of these popes saints, so raising them to the place of heaven. And we have the woman and the child, and she has what appears to be stars around her head, and she's throned on the throne of heaven, I guess is what you could call it. So this is really a picture of what Revelation is talking about. We have a rosette pattern here, which is a Templar cross. Presence of Anacletus legate comes cardinal priest of St. Sabina. Thus the kingdom of Sicily came into being, which was the last for more than 7 centuries. Southern Italy stood solidly behind Anacletus, and King Roger became his most powerful secular supporter. For Monte Cassino, this was another weighty reason to pursue the course of action chosen before. So what appears to have gone on here in the build-up to the Crusades is what similarly happened to the build-up to the First and Second World Wars and the establishment of Israel in the early 20th century. And that is this reform papacy of Gregory VII. And it seems to be that this reform papacy was the lead motivation behind forming the Crusades to take back the region of Palestine and create this kingdom of Jerusalem. With the papal reform, there's a distinct group that are moving the Catholic Church towards a temple system like there was in Jerusalem, and that is one of a church controlling the secular state of the Holy Roman Empire, which is what we see in the prophecy of Revelation, where the woman or the whore church, she's a whore of Babylonian mystery religion, and she's riding a beast, the political systems of the earth. What I meant by the similarity to the build up to World War I and II, we see in that a lot of banking, I guess, elite families like the Rothschilds meddling years before in the politics of the UK and America and all the countries involved in the wars to build up to going to war, which the end motivation of that war was to establish the nation of Israel and re-establish Jerusalem as its capital. And it's just I always call it's a neo-crusade to re-establish this city again in this region. And today we have this big Israel uniting with Ukraine and the re-establishment of the Belt and Road project, which seems to be these people's obsession of having this trading city and this trading belt. So whether the wounded head is a re-establishment of the fallen Rome, or it's a re-establishment of the fallen Jerusalem, we still have this new kingdom of Jerusalem that isn't really talked about much. We know about the Crusades, but they've re-established this whole kingdom of Jerusalem, and it's all based around the Silk Road and trade of the Knights Templar Knights that came in from the Crusades. Also, we have these kings that are related to the beast of the sea, kings that quite potentially were the descendants of the 10 tribes of Israel. So here we have these kings giving their crowns over to the beast. 10 powers, the 10 horns of the beast of the Western Roman Empire. And we have these 10 kings in the Western regions, these 10 horns or powers, which I think are the power or the horn that was given to the 10 tribes of Israel. So when we look at how Rome was divided in the time of Constantine, it was Eastern and Western Rome, and it was divided into approximately 10 regions. So we have Britain, Gaul, Spain, Carthage, which is North Africa, Macedonia, Anatolia, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, including Libya. And I'll count those. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Later, after the Crusades, we have the kingdoms of Jerusalem. Here's a little picture somebody's made up the 10 divisions of the Roman Empire, 476 AD, fall of Rome. So we've got the Anglo-Saxons, Franks, Suevi, Visigoths, Vandals, Burgundians, Alemanni, Lombards, Ostrogoths, and Heruli. That is just the western portion of the Roman Empire. So either way, I would go with probably the inclusion of the whole Roman Empire that was divided during the time of Constantine. And why I would do that is because this is the region that the apostles went to, the 12 apostles. And we know that Peter went up to Parthia, around the Black Sea here, and the apostles made their way from the eastern portion over through to the western portions of Europe, North Africa and Carthage, to the people who had moved there from the Assyrian exile. So these are the people that they were collecting the 144,000 from, and the leftovers, the remnant of 12 tribes, 12,000 were chosen from each tribe, and then the 10 crowns are amongst these people. The beast itself is, I believe, also part of the tribes of Japheth, because in Genesis it says that the people of Japheth will be great and they'll dwell in the tents of Shem. So the Semitic people have given the crowns to the beast system, which was initially Roman, and the Romans were descendants of the tribes of Japheth. So Constantine the Great was the first Christian Roman emperor, apparently. Upon his ascension to emperor, Constantine enacted numerous reforms to strengthen the empire. He restructured the government, separating civil and military authorities. Constantine pursued successful campaigns against the tribes of the Roman frontiers, such as the Franks, the Alemanni, the Goths, and the Sarmatians, and resettled territories abandoned by his predecessors during the crisis of the 3rd century with citizens of Roman culture. Diocletian had chosen Nicomedia in the east as the capital during the Tetrarchy, not far from Byzantium, well situated to defend Thrace, Asia, and Egypt, all of which had required his military attention. Constantine had recognized the shift of the center of gravity of the empire from the remote and depopulated west to the richest cities of the east, and the military strategic importance of protecting the Danube from barbarian excursions and Asia from a hostile Persia in choosing his new capital, as well as being able to monitor shipping traffic between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Licinius' defeat came to represent the defeat of rival center of the pagan and Greek-speaking political activity in the east, as opposed to the Christian and Latin-speaking Rome, and it was proposed that a new eastern capital should represent the integration of the East into the Roman Empire as a whole, as a center of learning, prosperity, and cultural preservation for the whole of the Eastern Roman Empire. So it says eventually, however, Constantine decided to work on the Greek city of Byzantium, which offered the advantage of having already been extensively rebuilt on Roman patterns of urbanism during the preceding century by Septimus Severus and Caracalla, who had already acknowledged its strategic importance. The city was thus founded in 324, dedicated on the 11th of May 330, and renamed Constantinopolis, Constantine's city, or Constantinople in English. Special commemorative coins were issued in 330 to honor the event. So the last emperor, or the last Roman emperor of Western Rome was Romulus Augustus, nicknamed Augustulus. And Romulus was placed on the imperial throne by his father, the Magister Militum Orestes, and at the time still a minor, was little more than a figurehead for his father. After Romulus ruled for just 10 months, the barbarian general Odoacer defeated and killed Orestes and deposed Romulus. As Odoacer did not proclaim any successor, Romulus is typically regarded as the last Western Roman emperor. His deposition marking the end of the Western Roman Empire as a political entity. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus is sometimes used by historians to mark the transition from antiquity to medieval period. So after the fall of the western portion of Rome, the eastern portion was ruled from Constantinople, and hereditary rule of the family of Constantine until Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, re-established the Western Roman Empire under the Holy Roman Empire. He was a member of the Carolingian dynasty, was king of the Franks from 768, king of the Lombards 774, and the first Holy Roman Emperor from 800. Charlemagne succeeded in uniting the majority of Western and Central Europe and was the first recognized emperor to rule from Western Europe since the fall of Western Roman Empire, and 3 centuries earlier. Now, I believe the fall of the Western Roman Empire was the end of the beast from Daniel, the Roman beast, because when we get to Revelation, we don't see the beast until it comes out of the sea in Revelation 13. And I believe that this Western portion of the Holy Roman Empire is the beast that rises out of the sea with 7 heads and 10 horns and 10 crowns. We can see that the beast of Daniel, the 4th beast of Daniel, has 10 horns, and then the little horn comes up amongst the 10 horns. I believe the little horn was the Herod family, starting with King Herod and his father. And I've explained this in another video, how the beast is Roman, and the 10 provinces of the Roman Empire, which Judea was one of them. It came up among the provinces of the Roman Empire. And the king of Judea was King Herod. Not all Herods were kings, but all Herods ruled Roman provinces. But there is no little horn in the Beast of Revelation. And some people say that the Pope is the little horn, but it can't be, because it's not describing that in the Beast of Revelation, which are clearly about a time during and after John gave the prophecy. the Catholic Church didn't arise till hundreds of years later. Daniel's prophecies were finished when Jesus made the new covenant. And it's obvious that these beast empires were about the empires up until the time of Jesus, and shortly after, or a few hundred years after, the Roman Empire fell and became the beasts that John was describing in his prophecies. So the expanded Frankish state that Charlemagne founded was known as the Carolingian Empire. He was canonized by AntiPope Papal III, an act later treated as invalid, and he is now regarded by some as beatified, which is a step on the path to sainthood in the Catholic Church. Charlemagne was the eldest son of Pepin the Short and Bertrand of Laon. He was born before their canonical marriage. He became king of the Franks in 768 following his father's death, and was initially as co-ruler with his brother Carloman I until the later death in 771. As sole ruler, he continued his father's policy towards protection of the papacy and became its sole defender, removing the Lombards from power in northern Italy and leading an incursion into Muslim Spain. He also campaigned against the Saxons to his east, Christianizing them upon penalty of death, and leading to events such as the massacre of Verdun. He reached the height of his power in 800 when he was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day and Old St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Charlemagne was called the Father of Europe, as he united most of Western Europe for the first time since the classical era of the Roman Empire, and united parts of Europe that had never been under Frankish or Roman rule. His rule spurred the Carolingian Renaissance, a period of energetic cultural and intellectual activity within the Western Church. The Eastern Orthodox Church viewed Charlemagne less favourably due to his support of the Filioque and the popes having preferred him as emperor over Byzantine Empire's first female monarch, Irene of Athens. These and other disputes led to the eventual later split of Rome and Constantinople in the Great Schism of 1054. Charlemagne died in 814. He was laid to rest in Aachen Cathedral in his imperial capital city of Aachen. He married at least 4 times and had 3 legitimate sons who lived to adulthood. Only the youngest of them, Louis the Pious, survived to succeed him. Charlemagne and his predecessors are direct ancestors of many of Europe's royal houses, including the Capetian dynasty, the Ottonian dynasty, the House of Luxembourg, and the House of Ivrea. So if the Holy Roman Empire was the beast of the sea, it has 7 heads. And if we look at this picture here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 imperial coat of arms under the coat of arms of the 8th Holy Roman Empire. And these coat of arms were the coat of arms of the Prince Electors. The Prince Electors, or electors for short, were the members of the electoral college that elected the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. From the 13th century onwards, the Prince Electors had the privilege of electing the monarch, who would be crowned by the Pope. After 1508, there were no imperial coronations and the election was sufficient. So electors were rulers of the Reichsstand imperial estates, enjoying precedence over the other imperial princes. They were, until the 18th century, exclusively entitled to be addressed with the title Durchlord, can't pronounce that very well, Serene highness. In 1742, the electors became entitled to the superlative Most Serene Highness, while other princes were promoted to Durchlot. As rulers of imperial estates, the electors enjoyed the privilege of imperial princes, including the right to enter into alliances, to autonomy in relation to dynastic affairs, and to precedence over other subjects. The Golden Bull granted them the privilegium de non appellando, which prevented their subject from lodging an appeal to a higher imperial court. However, while this privilege and some others were automatically granted to electors, they were not exclusive to them, and many of the larger imperial states were also to be individually granted some of or all of those rights of privilege. So in this picture, it's depicting the coat of arms representing the 7 original electors with the figure of Germania. So these are the 7 original electors of the Holy Roman Emperor. And it's highly likely that these families were descendants of Charlemagne, and the emperors who ruled the Holy Roman Empire came from these families, as they would have had preference for their own royal family lines. So it's beginning around the 1273, and with the confirmation of the Golden Bull of 1356, there were 7 electors: the Archbishop of Trier, Mainz, and Cologne, the Duke of Saxony, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Margrave of Brandenburg, and the King of Bohemia. Now, when you start looking into the families that came from these prince electors, they are the royal houses of Europe. So every single royal house of Europe is related to these people. So other electors were created later for Bavaria, Hanover, and Hesse-Kassel. The fact that the houses of Habsburg had established a de facto claim to the imperial crown made the electors' basic right nugatory by the 17th century. But when we go back, the House of Habsburg is related to all these royal families that go back to Charlemagne. As with the heads of the Greek Empire of Alexander the Great, which is divided into 4, the beast has 4 heads. Well, the beast of the sea has 7 heads. And what's interesting about this Holy Roman Empire, the emperors are chosen from around 7 different regions of the Western Roman Empire. So first we have the Franks, king of the Franks, who was Charlemagne, and the Lombards. Franks, king of Italy, so Italy and France. Then we have the German and Saxony kings, Bavaria, Burgundy, Italy, Germany. This Henry VI, he was the king of Germany, king of Italy, king of Burgundy, and king of Sicily. So this is this Sicilian empire that is started by Pope Anacletus II, who was the Pierleoni family. And there's a lot of links in the Sicilian mafia to these Jewish money-lending banking families of Italy. So if you're interested in that, have a look into it yourself. But the Pierleoni banking family of Rome were converted to Catholicism. And how many more of these black nobility banking families, Roman families, were converted that we don't know about? And if they weren't converted, they were more than likely descendants of the Roman aristocracy who had interbred with the Herodian family and the Edomite converts. Here we have the German king, Henry VII, who's also the king of Jerusalem, the The King of Jerusalem was the supreme ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a Crusader state. Frederick II. So, is that one of the heads of the beast? So Germany, Italy, some of these places are all come under German rule, really, or German kingship. The kings rule different regions, but they're of the same families. Austria. Later on, we get the Habsburgs ruling in Spain, Hungary and Croatia, which come under Bohemia. So these are the main regions, which I think are the 7 heads that are on the beast of the sea. The 10 horns or 10 powers, I believe, are the kingdoms within these regions belonging to the 10 tribes that moved into these regions, and the crowns that they give over to the beast, which is the Holy Roman Empire. So, is the one of the 7 heads that is wounded the fallen Western Roman Empire, reborn as the Holy Roman Empire? Is it the Kingdom of Jerusalem or the Judean province that has been destroyed by the Romans and then brought back by the Crusaders as the Kingdom of Jerusalem? One thing we know is that both of these empires or these regions are part of the beast. And to me, it would seem that the Holy Roman Empire is the beast. The heads on the beast are 7 different regions, as I've shown you, the 7 prince electors. And we can see that in this Kingdom of Jerusalem that's been reborn, the kings of Jerusalem were part of these 7 elector families. So for the first kings that ruled the Kingdom of Jerusalem, we have the House of Bologna, King Godfrey, King Baldwin of France, the Count of Anjou, Montferrat, Holy Roman Empire, son of William V, Marquis of Montferrat, and Judith of Babenberg. Sounds a bit like Battenberg, probably changed from there. Henry of Champagne, France, Henry VI, Holy Roman Emperor, and Constance of Sicily. Here's this province of Sicily again, Kingdom of Sicily. So we can see that these are probably kings that are in allegiance with these Pierre Leone bankers. And then we have a bunch of regents that ruled this area as well. So House of Hohenstaufen, which is the German kings, Bavarian. So all of these families would have been part of these prince-elector families, royal families. Now, not all the prince-electors were royal families. Some of them were prince-bishops. So they were from Cologne, Mainz, Trier. Not all of these were prince-electors, but these were some of the prince-electors from the church. And, you might as well just say it's the same families, because these bishops were from these families, because it was the general rule of these families to give one of their sons over to the church and to join the church hierarchy so that they could control both church and state. We have some of these families here: the King of Bohemia, Elector Palatine. These are their titles, not necessarily their families. Elector of Bavaria, Elector of Palatine, Elector of Hanover, Brandenburg. The 3 ecclesiastical electors: the Archbishop of Mainz, the Archbishop of Trier, the Archbishop of Cologne. The 4 selector electors: the King of Bohemia, the Count of Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, the Margrave of Brandenburg. If we look at the House of Hohenstaufen, we have coat of arms here, and they've got the country there from the Duchy of Swabia, Holy Roman Empire, Kingdom of Sicily, Kingdom of Jerusalem, founded in 1079, founder Frederick I, Duke of Swabia, final ruler Conradin, titles Duke of Swabia, King of Italy, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, King of Jerusalem, King of the Romans, King of Burgundy, Count of Burgundy. So these families are kings of all these regions that are taking up these prince-elect positions. Anyway, so these titles didn't necessarily go to the same families, but these families were the kings and queens of Europe who took on these titles, monarchs of Bohemia, and these titles gave them the right to be prince-elects and to vote for the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. These families go back to Charlemagne, they go back to the old kings of France and Germany. And as I've showed in other videos, they link back to the Roman aristocracy. If you want to do a personal search, you can search the origins of each of these houses: the House of Habsburg, the House of Wittelsbach, House of Lorraine. Basically, all these families intertwine and go back to the same few original sources. So it's up to you what you want to think about which head is the seventh wounded head of the beast. I think the beast itself is Holy Roman Empire, and that one of these heads is, as stated with the Alexander beast, a kingship within that empire. We know that Alexander's empire was divided into four different families ruling the Greek Empire, and the beast had 4 heads. As you can see from this image I found, I'm not the only one who's saying this and seeing that it fits in with the prophecies of Revelation. Thanks again. See you in the next video.